My guest this week is Elliot Connor. Elliot is a science writer, presenter and producer. He's perhaps best known for founding the international environmental NGO Human Nature Projects, which supports volunteers across 106 countries. He's the author of Human Nature, stating his life's goal as reframing our human relationships with the natural world. In his 18 years to date, he has achieved various honours and accolades, including Samsung's 2020 𝗂𝗶𝗃𝗀 Award, Young Citizen of the Year, Young Landcare Leader, and Young Wildlife Photographer of the Year. In February 2020, he gave a TEDx talk on evolution and how to save the world. Welcome, Elliot. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Peter. It's a pleasure to join with you today.
You've just finished your HSC. Your life's goal is to reframe our human relationships with nature. How do we go about that? How do we reconnect?
It's a very difficult question, and I mean, I could say my life's goal is answering that question in itself. How on earth do we do that? Because I think once we know the answer, we'll be halfway there to solving it. But there are a few things which I think are important to keep in mind. So one of those principles is something I refer to as conservation's 4Cs. Which are connection, curiosity, creativity, and collaboration. So they're meant to be like these four key intangibles, looking to change the way we view conservation, making it more people-oriented, so that we're measuring our success by how many people we reach, how many people we change the perspectives of. Obviously, people are the issue when it comes to environmental degradation, but we're also the solution. So that's one key change to the way we approach these issues. The other one, I think, is the more fundamental, and that's just looking at what each and every individual can do. So I call it mass individualism, where you're trying to create a model, as I did with Human Nature Projects, where you're really tailoring the impact a given person can make to their interest, to their skill set, and tying that also in with a collective, so the mass part of the individualism, where you're being able to step up their impact, being able to connect them with like-minded persons so that the impact can be sustained and scaled. That's really critical. So with sort of those two key principles, that's the way I'm tackling these sorts of issues, but really it is a problem with our mindset. So humanas is the term I've recently coined to express sort of where I'd like us to head long term, looking at animals as you would other human beings. That's the most fundamental principle. If we can do that, all else follows.
Now, you've obviously got your finger in a lot of different pies. So what's a typical day for Elliot Connor like?
I'm not sure there is a typical day. I wish there were sometimes, but that's the life I lead. It's a long day often, so I start very early, finish very late due to international time differences mostly. Sometimes I'll speak with a dozen people daily in a dozen different countries all across the world. That's an experience in itself, and one of the most rewarding parts of starting up Human Nature Projects and all the other work I do. Being able to speak with these inspiring young leaders, in many cases, these leaders of today and of tomorrow. That's a major component of it. Obviously, juggling various projects on the side. I run this podcast of mine, the Human Nature Cast, now in its third series, editing this first book of mine, Human Nature, which will be coming out in the new year, and looking at doing more wildlife filmmaking. So when I can, obviously I get out and do more of that, but trying to bridge sort of what I've been doing in science communication more generally to that more specific niche in itself. So doing lots of sort of background work on that, and generally the role I take is as this high-level thinker. I like looking at these broad concepts, these humanas, these how can we revolutionize conservation. I think it's so interesting if you look at these most fundamental high-level principles and rework them to think how we can move forward. So that's what I spend, I guess, my downtime doing, trying to save the world. Yeah. Something like that.
Yeah. Well, you're well on your way. I think with such a positive outlook and such a determination for reconnecting humans with nature, and I think it's definitely a life's work ahead of you.
No doubt about that, yes.
Okay, we're going to listen to your first song, Circle of Life by Elton John and Tim Rice. So this is from The Lion King. Can you tell us why you picked this song?
The Lion King is a brilliant movie, very close to, I guess, sort of anthem for conservation. Circle of Life concept tying in obviously to many of the various rhetorics used in terms of living in harmony with nature. I was on a webinar with Jane Goodall recently, who's an incredible speaker, has the most wonderful ideas, but she was speaking about sort of this heart-mind disconnect. So I think that's really important. It's a really powerful way of putting our current state, in that we sort of know there's something wrong and we're thinking about it, but we're not going from those more visceral feelings where we do know that we're going rapidly downhill. We're sort of postponing that realization. I believe the work Disney does with The Lion King and other films is fixing that in the most fundamental way possible. And The Lion King, brilliant movie. The most recent Disney one, obviously, was directly related to conservation. So they gave a substantial amount of their profits to lion conservation in Africa.
Okay, welcome back. Elliot, it's got a line in there that says, but all are agreed as they join the stampede. You should never take more than you give. Are we in a stampede? Is that how you see it?
I think it certainly has some parallels to a stampede. So it's interesting that you drew on that part of the lyrics, but we definitely are in some very rapid motion, typically expressed as a decline in nature at the cost of human development. That's an oversimplification, but we definitely are speeding up evolution and natural change beyond any bounds it has known historically. So yeah, it is a stampede of sorts, but I think actually the latter part of those lyrics are the more insightful. You should never take more than you give in this circle of life. So being able to have a renewing cycle, having a cycle which is regenerative, which can be sustained long term. I mean, the common parallel is with indigenous peoples and custodianship of the land. So that's really interesting to consider as perhaps a solution to this stampede, to this breakneck progress, development. But it is a stampede of sorts, I would say that.
Now, you've mentioned you've been to South Africa several times with your family, and then more recently doing some filming. Your parents, are they involved in wildlife or conservationists?
Both my parents actually work in leadership development coaching. So my mother is more focused with educational coaching, principals, school leaders, whereas my father works in corporate side. I guess it's more the British background, that upbringing, which has contributed to who I am today. Because bird watching, the long walks in the countryside, that's all far more part of the British culture. They've got the annual Rutland Bird Festival, Rutland Bird Fair, which is a huge event. The RSPB is the largest conservation charity in Europe, I believe. It's huge, million members on that scale. So I think that has a much greater impact on who I am.
Now, on one of these trips, I'm fascinated. You were stalked by a leopard in Botswana when you were 10 years old. That would have freaked me out. I think at 10 years old, and I probably would have gone down the track of being an accountant or a doctor or something like that. Is that what you felt?
Oh, yeah. So it's a long time ago, and it has become somewhat of a campfire story in the family. But what happened essentially was we were camping in the north of Botswana. It was part of a campground called 𝗀𝗄𝗯, and it was completely unfenced. All the animals were wandering through. Not uncommon in that quite remote region, honestly, of Africa. So when it all happened, I was walking back from the campsite toilet blocks with my family, and I was 10 years old at the time, and I was just coming out into the light of the campfire circle. But I had this almost a sixth sense, and I turned around, obviously, and there behind me was this young leopard, so crouched, stalking low to the ground, maybe 2-3 meters back. So I locked eyes with it for a good few seconds, and that's something which can still come back to me, one of these very vivid experiences. But I believe I said something like, "I think there's something behind me." So somewhat lost it in the moment, but that was my chance for a punchy line. And my brother turned around, he had a flashlight, lit it up with a beam, and they're ambush predators, so once it had been seen, that's game over, and nothing could have come of that. But I don't remember any fear as such. I have obviously been afraid various times on safari. It can be hazardous, there's no doubt about that. But I think in that sort of 5-10 second space, that window, which I might have been feeling afraid for, was far more the adrenaline rush. You don't have time almost to process it. So in hindsight, perhaps, but less so in the moment. It was quite an experience, that's for sure.
Now, you've also been to Europe more recently. You went to volunteer on a raptor and hedgehog rehabilitation centre. That's an interesting combination. But part of your trip was you got to release a rehabilitated vulture. Is that correct?
Yes. So I was over in France for about a month, and it was in bleak midwinter, so snow covered for a lot of the time, icy for the rest. But yeah, I guess the combination was more what was around, what was still active at that time, obviously. So the raptors are very large birds. They don't migrate within that European area mostly. So they still hung around, and we had lots of those in long-term care. But this griffon vulture was there for the entire month I was there, and we released it in the last week of my stay. So I'd seen it gradually recover. We had it in a huge aviary, like Jurassic Park enclosure, absolutely incredible size. But I'd watched it find its wings, being able to grow in confidence, feeding it blood, sausage, haggis, whatever, on the daily routine. So we took a day trip out into the French Alps to do the release, and obviously it's quite involved. The griffon vulture had to go in a very large dog kennel, which is how you transport the birds. It's a two-person job handling it. But we finally got it out there, and we gathered around, it's about half a dozen of us, on this absolutely sheer precipice of the French Alps. It was quite late in the day, so the sun was setting, glancing off all these surrounding slopes, absolutely magnificent. And I just remember watching it soaring out of the dog kennel into the sky with must have been 50-60 odd vultures just circling, because they do a research scientific project there to study them, leave out sheep carcasses donated by farmers. So there was this huge cloud of them circling overhead, and that was absolutely breathtaking. So another one of those moments I remember till the day I die. But the one thought I remember very clearly articulating in my brain as that sort of event took place was, what if everyone can experience this? That would be so powerful. So it sort of led me further down this path I'm on in terms of connecting people with nature, being able to use filmmaking particularly as a medium to share that. So that was one of the more pivotal moments, I think, in my brief journey thus far.
Oh, it would have been spectacular, especially the time of day you said, being up in the French Alps, being able to release this bird that you've helped rehabilitate and nurture, and watching it literally take its wings and fly off to freedom. It would have been truly emotional. We're going to listen to your second song now, quite a long song, but We Are the World by USA for Africa. So a bit more on the African theme. Is that why you chose it?
Not so much. I think the We Are the World is really interesting in sort of the backstory, I guess, the whole the way it came about and the purpose behind it. Clearly, it was done as this immense charitable effort. So that you could have these incredibly well-to-do celebrity singers rally behind such a cause for humanitarian aid in this instance, I think is really moving, and the song itself obviously is incredibly touching, the way it's composed. But yeah, it definitely gives me faith in humanity.
Welcome back, and yes, such a powerful song and a great message when people from all backgrounds or all musical backgrounds can rally together to work for a humanitarian cause. Talking of humanitarian cause, you founded Human Nature Projects. We sort of touched a little bit on this before. You have volunteers across 104 countries. That's a remarkable achievement. How did it originate? How did you come up with the plan to start this, and what are your philosophies behind it? What's the direction?
Yeah, two very good questions there, and it links quite closely to this time I was in France, actually, because in some of the long winter nights I spent over there, I sort of took it upon myself to look into what was going on in this environmental field more generally. So I'd been volunteering locally for a good few years prior to that time, but I was wanting to do something more, to step out in particular on this global stage. And I had the sense that something wasn't quite right in terms of how it all was being done. So the first volunteering placement I took up was with BirdLife Australia, and they have this discovery centre, so tiny little museum in a local park, and it's great. The staff are very enthusiastic, but all their volunteers are certainly the far side of 70. They're all very old, grey-bearded retirees. So for a 14, 15-year-old starting out there, that was firstly quite a shock. And they also don't get any visitors. So the Australian public, completely oblivious for the most part to the absolutely incredible bird life we've got. It's 700, 800 species versus, what is it, 350, 400 in the UK. And I would argue, clearly more impressive, but perhaps that's a contentious point. So yeah, that really impressed upon me, how strange it was that we couldn't be doing more, certainly in Australia, in terms of what was going on. And Australia has the second most threatened species of any country, second or third. So that was sort of a mental process behind it. But anyway, I ended up looking at what these few odd hundred NGOs were doing and found that there was very, very little work being done in terms of educating and engaging the public from particularly more diverse backgrounds. So people who had absolutely no clue about environmental issues, who hadn't the foggiest idea how to go about combating them. There simply wasn't a place for these people in the current system. So Human Nature Projects essentially grew out of some of my thinking there. So it's been really, really powerful seeing that come together over the past 18 odd months. It's been a journey for me, certainly, a huge learning curve, but it's scaled tremendously, as you say, over 100 countries now, and some of the most incredible people I'm speaking with. There's the most wonderful stories that have come out of it. But the philosophy is that people need a greater stake in conservation, that you have to engage with communities to make any impact sustainable. That's the basic premise, and if we get people engaged, those people will ultimately lead to more people getting engaged. We get this runaway effect, and we get people who are hopeful, firstly. That's really important. We're seeing people who are greenwashed, being the new word that's come about, people who are desensitized to the issues because they keep on being bombarded with news. But if people have some sort of solution, if they're engaged in bringing about positive change, then that completely changes the mindset. And if you give people that opportunity to connect with nature, to immerse themselves in it, we obviously move more towards this humanas, the human nature philosophy.
Yeah, and definitely, I think the more you expose people, as you say, the more connected they become. But the greenwashing is a real thing these days, and the algorithms that work in our social media circles and things like that, we keep getting reconnected with the same information over and over again. And ultimately, social media is channeling us down this one particular route, as it were. So yeah, the more opportunities people can get to see the bigger picture or see the other side of the story, the more chance you've got of getting people to act in a better way for the wildlife and for the environment as a whole.
Definitely, yeah. And people are most interested in the people who are creating these solutions. They certainly care about the wildlife, about the lions, say in Africa, which are dying out. But if you tell them the stories of the 𝗪 peoples who are learning to coexist with them, that's suddenly far more engaging. It takes it up to another level. So if you can get people interested in the other people who are being involved in these solutions, that certainly changes the dialogue around the issues we're combating.
Yeah, definitely. You've worked in the media industry. We've spoken about this briefly, but you've done your own short films. You've worked on some other filming in Africa. Do you prefer to be behind the camera or in front of it? Are you a bit of that? You mentioned David Attenborough earlier.
Oh, so it really depends on the context. I mentioned the time with Wild Earth in South Africa at the start of this year, soon to be last year. That's a presenter role I would really struggle with. I have the utmost respect for the people who did that because as opposed to what, say, an African tour guide is doing, essentially giving the same spiel to each new set of guests. This is an impala, this is a lion, this is a rhinoceros, XYZ, it eats leaves, it eats grass. They have to come up with original content day in, day out for these die-hard fans. So that I would find incredibly challenging. But I do enjoy this science communication, being in front of camera, telling the story. So it's something I feel I need to step more into. But for now, mostly behind camera, mostly directing, managing, having that high-level approach is where I'm starting from. And then, who knows, perhaps I'll go Attenborough ways. But of course, Attenborough started out as BBC controller, so that's the path he took. I don't know where mine will lead.
Well, that's right. Don't know. And he took the opportunity, was it to do ZooQuest? And if my memory serves me right, the animal handler either left or got ill after the second episode. So he started having to handle the animals himself and got literally thrown in the deep end. We've spoken about David Attenborough. I mean, obviously, he's an enormous influence in the wildlife information world, the documentaries and the films he's made. Unfortunately, more recently, he's got a bit of criticism for portraying wildlife in a fashion where people thought that, you know, the environment's in a better state than it really was. What's your take on this?
It's a really hard question, and you're right, it is one that's come up in the last 6 odd months. I personally believe that Attenborough's brilliance, the role he's played for the past 60, 70 odd years in wildlife filmmaking, has been to create this really solid base, this groundwork, this foundation, upon which the rest of conservation and environmentalism has been built. So he's been connecting audiences in the millions with nature across the globe, nature at its best, typically, as you say, in pristine environments. I don't find fault in that because I do believe that people need to see what it could be like, what I guess the end goal is for much of what remains of natural places, and if we restore degraded areas as well, what those areas could be like. So he started his latest spiel in the site of Chernobyl, which of course is a powerful message in itself. But Chernobyl has become this conservation success story, where you've got dormice returning to the red forest after decades, where you've got large animals, you've got bears wandering through, you've got deer, and you've got this whole landscape has become, it's called a radioecological zone. So it's sprung up from this catastrophic disaster. It's all recovered with all due speed, all due haste. So I think for Attenborough, I understand his most recent change of messaging. So he has taken on a more bleak tone. He's nearing, obviously, unfortunately, the end of his time, the end of his career on air. And he has taken that more hard-fast stance, which is how this whole dialogue arose. But I don't believe he's done that too late. I don't believe he should have done so sooner. I think what he's done in terms of connecting people with nature has been just as impactful as it could be. And where we take that next is a different dialogue, a different debate. But I think he's acted completely in the right.
Totally agree. And I think with Blue Planet 2, when like that was made, it showed a much bleaker picture. The message was probably gravitating towards the seriousness of the situation, the scene with the walruses falling off the cliff to their demise. And it's even more powerful when you look at when he aired that to a public audience, and you could just see the members of the audience really getting emotional over that. And the latest one becoming a bit of doom and gloom. It has to be. It's if that's what forces our political leaders and our environmental leaders into a bit more serious action, then so be it.
Yeah, and I think the interesting point to consider about some of the criticism that is obviously launched at each successive documentary production, Attenborough or otherwise, is that it shows people really do care about what's being shown on screen. You have Planet Earth 2's very famous sequence about the iguana baby being chased by snakes, trying obviously to reach the safety of the rocks, and that caused an absolutely huge backlash when it came to light that sequence, that scene had been cut from various different baby iguanas making this same dash. People were so invested in the plight of this young iguana that they really wanted it to be 100% genuine, 100% real. But if you can make people care enough, that's a success in itself. So I think there's also that double-edged sword, I guess, a way you could look at the criticism too.
I'm going to listen to your third song now, Elliot. A bit of a change, theme from Jurassic Park. Why did you pick this one?
Oh, well, I had to include at least one of the compositions of our greatest modern composer, John Williams. What he's done is incredible, and I think increasingly in wildlife documentaries we're having this Hollywood cinematic feel to the music, with Hans Zimmer composing Planet Earth 2's themes. But Jurassic Park is a great film, great cinematography. I've dabbled in special effects as well, so coming at it from that angle is incredible, what they did with it. But I think also from that conservation lens, looking at de-extinction, synthetic biology and such, how that could change the field, I find it interesting seeing that in Jurassic Park as well.
Okay, we'll just listen to your third song choice, Elliot, the theme from Jurassic Park. John Williams, a fantastic composer, as you said. If you were able to extract DNA on an extinct species and bring it back to life, would you do that?
Oh God, I could tell where that question was going from if. Would I do it? Yeah, I would. I would do it carefully though. So I think there are a few really important considerations to make. Obviously, there's a lot of debate, whether it's moral, whether it's ethical. I think, luckily, where technology is at, who knows in 100 years, but certainly for the foreseeable future, we're only going to be looking at species that have gone extinct a few odd thousand years ago, perhaps up to a mammoth, but certainly not beyond that. So that's great news, because it means, hopefully, fingers crossed, these animals we bring back will still have, obviously, a home to go back to, which is the first point. So if we bring back Tasmanian tiger, for example, most or a good fraction of that habitat is still there. So some of the beautiful pristine wilderness areas surviving in Tasmania. But if we brought back, say, a saber-toothed tiger, that might struggle. If we brought back a Tyrannosaurus Rex, what on earth are you going to do with it? So perhaps that's what Jurassic Park shows, with all the successive failures of them commercializing nature. But I think de-extinction is really powerful, and provided we use it, keeping in mind some of that perspective, I would definitely be all for that.
Yeah, I know the Australian Museum did a fair bit of work on the isolating different sequences from the thylacine pup that they've got there, with some success to a degree. But yeah, obviously a lot of controversy and a lot of debate around whether morally or ethically it should be done.
Well, definitely. One of the cases, importantly in Australia, is the gastric brooding frog. So something we came across in the 1970s, 80s, and it disappeared almost as soon as science discovered it. But obviously, incredibly unique species. The name says it all in terms of how they raise their young, swallowing them. So if we can bring that back, and we have some surviving samples in fairly good condition, that's quite a realistic project for de-extinction, and we have every reason to do so, because clearly humans are very strongly implicated in its disappearance. So something like that definitely could be achieved, and I hope will be achieved in the future.
Now, I know you had many inspirational figures growing up. Like we've talked about David Attenborough, you mentioned Jane Goodall earlier. Others, you mentioned Edward Wilson and Gerald Durrell and Lawrence Anthony. I mean, all of those huge in their individual conservation efforts. Would you describe yourself as a conservationist, or are you more of humanitarian? I mean, we spoke about it earlier, that human nature, that it's sort of intertwined. Does it need to be more one way or the other?
Ooh, you see, I would still describe myself as a conservationist. I consider myself somewhat of a humanitarian, but that to a lesser extent. So I do some voluntary work in the sort of world peace spaces even, which is great fun. I do believe those two causes are very strongly interlinked, and with the Sustainable Development Goals, you have them side by side. I think the statistic is that 80% of the Sustainable Development Goals are severely impacted by biodiversity loss. So we do need conservation to bolster humanitarian efforts, but I would like to see them more closely interlinked, that said, particularly the other way around. So I'd like to see humanitarian efforts bolstering conservation, considering how much conservation can give back. There are so many wonderful examples in Mozambique, say, where you had tremendous civil wars for much of the latter part of the 20th century, where now you're finally starting to see some of their natural areas recover. You have 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 National Park being incredibly famous for its wildlife, and their wildlife numbers were decimated, shot to near oblivion during the Civil War. Obviously, elephant ivory helps to trade for arms, but much of the rest of the wildlife, so buffaloes, lions, hippos, all shot for bushmeat. It's been, 15, 20 years since that Civil War came to an end, and the wildlife populations have increased by 10 times in some cases. They're absolutely soaring, thanks to some very carefully controlled conservation efforts, which means tourism is going way up. It's on the rise, which gives back to local communities. It's this repeating cycle which just keeps on giving back and giving back. You have in many of the gift shops and zoos, you'll now see these beads, these necklaces and bracelets, which are crafted by African peoples in these communities as a more sustainable source of income, instead of going out and hunting for bushmeat, say. So there are all manner of ways in which the two can be interlinked, but hopefully increasingly so into the future.
Yes, definitely. I read you're a wildlife carer as well. You've always had some sort of menagerie at home, whether it be a stick insect, leaf beetles, or some such things. We talked about, or we mentioned Gerald Durrell just previously in one of your inspirations. Was your home very much like My Family and Other Animals? Is that your childhood?
Oh, I certainly wish it were, and I am and was inspired by Gerald Durrell for much of my youth. It's been the book I've read more times than any other, My Family and Other Animals. Certainly a good half a dozen times I've gone through it, front to back, and I think it was a different time he was growing up in, but still I very much try and live out that life, draw those parallels. So yeah, I've raised eggs of assassin bugs, of fig tree leaf beetles, of stick insects, all from my garden, which I was exploring. I spent 6 months down there, where I would really take every spare afternoon I had just to go down there. It's quite overgrown, quite jungle-esque, but I had a macro lens that I borrowed actually from my parents. I later upgraded to be able to take photos of these mini beasts, and that was amazing for me because I posted them online, learned to identify the species, learned more about their life stories, so that was great. And yeah, as you say, now doing the wildlife rescuing, so that brings itself a whole new wealth of stories to tell, but I'm sure we won't have time. But yeah, I think it's amazing.
Okay, we're going to listen to your fourth song now, which is This Is Bert by John Powell from the movie How to Train Your Dragon. I've watched this movie a couple of times, and obviously the main theme in it is the dragons are the enemy. They steal our sheep, they cause devastation and destruction. But ultimately, the lead character who shoots down a dragon ends up feeling bad and rehabilitates this dragon and gets a special connection. And through that, they learn that they can live in harmony with each other. From what we've been talking about, this is your underlying message all the way through, is once humans understand nature, then it becomes how we can live together and in mutual symbiosis.
Yeah, so How to Train Your Dragon, this soundtrack, almost a theme in many ways, was sort of a wild card for me, and it's a movie I greatly admire. It's been 3 in the series now, and it sort of tracks this journey of conservation, which I find fascinating. And being able to attach it to dragons obviously distances it, so you can go closer to these quite sensitive subjects, obviously. If it was about Maasai tribes killing lions, you wouldn't be able to do the same thing. But because it is about dragons, this mythical creature, then that is permissible. And at the end of the 3rd installment, spoiler alert, they do end up letting go these dragons, which I found the most heart-wrenching, but the most frustrating ending, because as a conservationist, that's not the end goal. I don't want humans to separate from other animals. I want us to find a means of coexistence. So yeah, I've found it really enlightening in terms of being able to explore some of these themes, and obviously as an analogy to bring to people. If you say it's like How to Train Your Dragon, there's an instant way in which you can communicate these sorts of messages.
Okay, Elliot, I want to talk to you about your book. Can you tell me what it's about, or is it hush-hush at the moment?
Yeah, so this project actually arose in the lockdown we had due to coronavirus. I spent a few months where obviously we weren't allowed outdoors. I was homeschooling at the time. I obviously had a bit of spare time in my hand, less of the daily commute, and I set about writing this book more about this human nature philosophy. So talking about much of what's been covered on this podcast today, but looking at our human relationship with nature, past, present, future especially, in terms of where it all might go and how we can change it moving forward, which is this fundamental question we started with. How can you change human nature, and looking at humanas as well. This word, which arose mostly due to my writing the book, it wasn't there to start with, but it's been a journey for me certainly, and looking at how our perception of ourselves as Homo sapiens, as human beings, distinct from other animals, has changed over the years. So looking at some of the absolutely mind-boggling research into animal intelligence, social behavior, cognition, the way human beings, in some amazing exceptional cases, have been able to communicate with them, interact with them, better understand them, and what we can learn from that.
I look forward to seeing that. Now, you did a TEDx talk, Evolution and How to Save the World. It's a great title. Can you give us a bit of an overview of what the talk was about?
Yeah, so I guess this was my first step out there in terms of trying to communicate about environmental issues and especially solutions to an audience who knew I was starting with a premise, nothing about the subject. So trying to make it open, engaging, and simplify it to the bone. So hence evolution and how to save the world. I was looking at 5 core laws, ideas, concepts from evolution, which is something most people have quite a good idea about. Natural selection, survival of the fittest. We've all heard the phrases. So linking that to how we can pursue sustainable development as human beings in the 21st century is one of those topics that keeps on coming up time and again. So that was my goal for it, and trying to communicate that in an engaging, entertaining way. Very early on in this speech, as you'll see if you watch the recording, I challenged the audience to a test, and it's a memory test given to chimpanzees. They're shown 9 numbers 1 to 9 on the screen, and then they have to click them through in order. But once the number 1 is clicked, all the others go blank. So they have to click on the right boxes where those numbers had been. And chimpanzees are absolute whizzes at it. They have a brilliant short-term memory. Humans fail abysmally. Even the best human memory champions don't stand a chance. So I find that really interesting, and that was the idea, to engage audiences.
I'm going to listen to your very last song now, and then we'll come back, and I just want to ask you about how people can get involved in the volunteer side of things that your organisation does. But Chariots of Fire by Vangelis, what's the reason for picking this one?
Yeah, it's quite different, I guess, to the other songs, and it's a song which has stuck with me for most of my life, actually. It's one of half a dozen tunes I can play on the piano. I'm not especially musical, I play the clarinet, but it's one of those songs which keeps on running in my head as just that inspirational, motivational theme.
I just want to finish, you do so much great work. We talked about the projects that people can volunteer and get connected with nature and get a bit more hands-on. For anyone who's listening to the podcast, so how can people get involved?
So if you head to humanNatureProjects.org, that will have obviously a form to sign up as a volunteer. If you're keen or interested, you can head over to my website, which is elliottconnor.com, which has more about some of the things I'm up to, if there's anything upcoming for my book, for my podcast, all the likes of that. But head to either of those, and that will give you some more to keep engaged with.
Fantastic. Well, that's been wonderful talking to you today, Elliot, and I really appreciate you taking the time out. I know you're on holiday, even though the rain is sort of keeping you indoors at the moment.
Yes.
I'm sure you're enjoying a bit of a break, and the macropods that are sharing the property with you. But no, I really appreciate you taking the time. It's just been really enlightening and very, very interesting.
Thank you, Peter. It's been an absolute pleasure.